Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to listen to it, watch it later on today, or another day. We'll be sending out a link after today's webinar sending out an email, after today's webinar that will contain a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. We'll get to as many questions as we can during today's webinar, and then any that we don't get to, the folks from Tricentis will be happy to follow up with you offline. And finally, we are doing a drawing today at the end of today's webinar for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 3 lucky winners, and those winners will be notified via email later on today. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is DevOps Quality Metrics That Matter, Forrester Research on 75 Common Metrics. Our speaker today is Wayne Ariola, who is the Chief Marketing Officer at Tricentis, and he's a great guy with lots of great information. So Wayne, I know you've got a lot to go over, so I'm just going to put myself on mute and let you get right to it.
Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I want to introduce the topic, DevOps Quality Metrics That Matter. And let me tell you a little story about what got us here. We knew that DevOps was an initiative that was basically talked about all the time throughout the Global 2000 organizations. And some organizations started earlier than others. Obviously, some started later, and some of them are just initiating a real expansion of the DevOps initiative. So we had a premise, and the premise was we should be able to learn from the early starters that made their mistakes. And the one thing that we thought could have been an indicator of true early adoption associated with DevOps is that they changed their metrics. And this started the research project that Tricentis did with Forrester. This was roughly an 8-month investigation of metrics and why they matter in DevOps. So with this, I want to dig into it, but if you're interested in the true depths of the research, please don't hesitate to hit this URL, which is tricentis.com DevOps-quality-metrics, and then you'll get all the gory details of the research. Everything we did, how we did it. And I believe there's up to 95 different metrics that we both identified as well as dissected in terms of DevOps. But I'm going to give you the shortcut in this webinar. I'm going to give you the key takeaways. I'm going to give you the regional differences. And I'm also going to give you the metrics throughout the delivery cycle to show you how they are differing and what changed. Again, our hypothesis was metrics matter. And since DevOps is a fundamental change to the organization, we thought that DevOps success can also be correlated to the fact that organizations changed their metrics in order to adopt a broader DevOps initiative. And this is what we did. We surveyed basically 603 global enterprise leaders who were directly responsible for their DevOps strategies. And this is where the partnership with Forrester came into play. We were able to leverage the Forrester name and the Forrester brand, as well as their analysts, to get into these leaders, these 603 global leaders associated with DevOps strategies. And then from that, what we were able to do is identify the firms that were more mature or successful with DevOps versus the ones who were maybe lagging in their DevOps adoption. So essentially, the ones who we found were successful, there was roughly 150 of these organizations that we, via questions and interviews, found that they were absolutely beyond the curve in terms of their DevOps adoption. And then what we did is we tried to dig into what quality metrics those experts actually measure and how they rate the value of those particular metrics. And then what we did is we ranked them, and we ranked them across the delivery lifecycle to compare, hey, maybe this metric is more valuable in this phase or this time horizon versus another. And then finally, we compared these metrics to what we would consider the laggards to see if there was any difference. So just in summary, I tried to come up with a method to identify leaders. From those leaders, we interrogated and found out what their metrics were. And then we diffed those metrics against what we declared as laggards. And guess what? We found a pattern, which has led to this presentation. And there was 3 major takeaways in terms of this approach. The first one is that there was a fundamental shift in the way these organizations thought about what their process should entail in terms of quality metrics. And inevitably, it came down to the fact that understanding business risk was the critical factor in DevOps success. And what I mean by this is organizations were really more focused on redefining what the definition of risk was for their organization. And when they did so, they altered the metrics to actually understand the level of risk that was within their release cycle. I thought that was kind of a no-brainer at first. I think when we first went into this study, the idea that business risk was critical was always on the top of our head, but it was really nice to see that the data actually extracted this concept, and it was inevitable that business risk was one of the core drivers associated with rearticulating metrics. The second thing we found was that the experts focused on more contextual metrics, essentially metrics that had a backing or a secondary or tertiary correlation behind it versus counting metrics or basic metrics. So for example, the number of test cases that run, the number of test cases, total test cases, things that were just basically counting metrics, time it took, versus things that were contextual, meaning did you have a metric that was more focused on coverage, business risk again in this area where there was a contextual metric associated with the outcome of the exercise versus a counting part of the exercise, meaning a counting metric would be, we got 80% pass. And what does that mean? Nothing. You can't, there's no context behind an 80% pass rate, right? And then finally, experts were more likely to measure the user experience across the end-to-end transaction, excuse me, while others relied on maybe within the boundaries of the single application, meaning that not only did they have more of maturity in terms of a bottom-up approach to overarching application quality, they were also extending their quality and the business risk measurement beyond the boundaries of the application across an end-to-end user journey. These were the 3 major takeaways. So when I first saw these takeaways, when I looked at them, and I'm like, I first said to myself, hey, this is fantastic because this is really a fundamental change, meaning that you just don't get to DevOps or you just don't get to a transformative way of delivering software without really taking a look at these 3 components. A, the user journey. B, context around metrics. And C, obviously, this understanding of business risk. So fundamentally, what we had found is that you just can't take a tools approach to DevOps. You really need to be looking at the business impact of the initiative itself. And if I had to summarize it, that would be it. It would mean that transformation is required. So let's also then talk about the top 20 metrics globally, okay? And what we did is we broke apart the top 5 here for each one of kind of the compartmentalized time horizon, okay? So within the build, within what we called functional validation, what we called integration testing, and this integration testing, by the way, also had to do with, level of APIs and connection into broader systems, rather than maybe the older definition of integration testing among components. And then finally, end-to-end regression testing. And the idea here is globally, we found this idea of less counting metrics started to come into the fold, right? So if we look at the number 1 metric that we found for build. It's the number of automated tests, right? Which would have been a counting metric, but it was prioritized by risk, meaning that they understood that in a release cycle, time was of the essence. Time is the new currency. So understanding how to prioritize based on risk is essential within the build process itself. The code coverage metric, which came in number 5, this was a little bit of a surprise to me. I would assume, especially within the context of the build, that code coverage would actually rate a lot higher, as that is a better indicator of what was accomplished via the test versus unit test pass-fail. Yet code coverage came in number 5. In terms of functional validation, requirements coverage was number 1. Total critical functional defects, number 2. And I think this is also interesting. I think as we've gone through the evolution of our testing and the scenarios that we've built, the prioritization of failure comes in 2 phases. One, at the actual documentation of the metadata around the test itself, which I find a lot of organizations fail to do. And 2, it's the prioritization of the defect once the defect or defect is found. I feel that both labeling is required, yet the prioritization effort comes in much, much more handy when the metadata associated with the test is constructed, delineates the criticality of the error versus doing it post. And I'm glad that this metric kind of highlighted itself early on in the priority. And then again, defect density was also interesting in terms of an overall process metric. Risk coverage here came in number 5. And the interesting thing about risk coverage coming in number 5 is that this metric probably didn't show itself at all 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I would not see risk coverage at the top level of any metrics that we would find. In terms of integration testing, again, requirements covered by test was very interesting. The new defects found, very interesting. And I think the reason for the new defects found within the integration testing horizon was the fact that organizations, when they're executing an end-to-end test, don't necessarily have control over all the dependencies. So when they do find that a dependency changed, this is where new defects come into play, which they did not necessarily have in terms of their purview, meaning your application called an API, there was a change in that API or a material change in the API, or your application made a material change in which that API was now necessarily not as effective as it was in the past. Defect density, again, I believe this is a great process metric, came in, pass-fail rate, and then again, coverage coming in at number 5. My assumption, guys, on coverage is that coverage in itself as number 5 is beginning to march up the stack ranks in terms of value. As we look at more and more extreme automation around the process, coverage is going to play a bigger and greater within the context of executing tests. I think the code coverage metric is going to be replaced more holistically by risk coverage, in which code coverage will be a component of. And then finally, end-to-end regression testing. So percentage of automated end-to-end test cases, requirements covered again, and we see, again, test case coverage as number 5. So the interesting progress here globally is that test coverage creeps in and coverage metrics start to creep in more dominantly as a very persistent metric rather than an augmented metric, and it becomes a more critical component of the end-to-end scenario. So then we look at how the differences are across the region. So let's take EMEA here. So within EMEA, we have build, and we see that test case coverage actually starts to creep up here, and it came in number 2. This was what the big difference. And then I want to take holistically this idea of the big changes, integration testing and end-to-end regression testing from an EMEA perspective. EMEA was always traditionally very, very good at the end-to-end regression testing. If you look at the general global processes that you've observed in my career, 20 years in software testing, what you had found was EMEA was much more scientific in their approach to testing. and the end-to-end regression testing was much, much more pronounced in these regions. So I would look at the maturity associated with these metrics in the end-to-end regression testing to be significantly more valuable when I look at EMEA, meaning they have a lot more experience, if I had to summarize here. So in the end-to-end regression testing, you see requirements covered by tests as number one, percent of automated end-to-end tests, total defects, percentage of test cases passed, and risk coverage, okay? Which is slightly different than what we had globally, but I would say that the end-to-end regression testing here, I would look at EMEA as a region to have a little bit more maturity in this area than others. Then you look at integration testing. And if you take this from the API perspective, EMEA was late to the game. So you see, I think here, a little bit more immaturity associated, excuse me, with what they're looking at. They're looking at pass-fail rates here. Although functional code coverage is layered in, this would have to do with their APIs that they control. Risk coverage, this is a very mature step in number 3. And then you see the new defects and requirements covered by tests as an interesting change here. But for EMEA, the interesting thing from the build perspective is test case coverage is starting to creep up as number 2. In APAC, critical defects is really the big change here as they begin to look at functional validation. I would say from APAC, as you looked at shift left, APAC was an early adopter in shift left concepts. So when you're looking at critical defects, the way I read into this metric from the metadata associated with the survey itself is that APAC actually spent more time in delineating the metadata associated with the initial test. So critical defects here comes in from the fact that they labeled their tests as critical as they were creating the test, not as the outcome of the defect itself. So critical defects were actually identified by the metadata associated with the test that is run, not the outcome of the test. Again, integration testing, APAC is a real early adopter in forward-thinking technology. Risk coverage becomes a top performer in terms of metrics. And then if you look at the end-to-end regression testing, again, risk coverage pops a lot higher in APAC. APAC also, in my mind, from the adoption of end-to-end regression testing from a user journey perspective, also shows a lot more maturity globally than some of the other practices that you do see. So risk coverage here starting to move up the charts in terms of popularity is a really interesting thing to note. I know I've probably tipped my hat a lot to the concept of risk coverage here, and I think it's valuable. I also think it's valid. If you look at the metadata that's built into the survey comments themselves, you'll see that this idea of risk coverage is pretty black and white, meaning that in the DevOps leaders, you see risk coverage really pronounced. In the DevOps laggards, you barely see it at all. So this idea of risk coverage being much, much more of a notable metric as organizations mature their DevOps practices is certainly a key finding. So the next thing that I want to move into is this idea of descriptions. So what we also try to do of all the metrics that were identified during this process is try to understand where do they fit in this paradigm, not only associated with time horizon, but also in terms of where they were valued. Are they a hidden gem? Meaning they're not measured that often, but they're highly valued. Were they value added, which means that they're not only valued highly, but also measured quite frequently. Are they overrated, meaning the value is low, but they're measured often, meaning a metric is used quite often, but it's valued very low. Or are they a distraction, meaning that sometimes they're used, but they're not very highly valued. So we put all the metrics into this beautiful 2x2 quadrant. You can't do anything these days without a 2x2 matrix. So we thought we would use it. So just to give you again, the description, value added metrics that are used frequently by DevOps experts and consistently rated valuable by the organization measured them. Hidden gem, metrics that are not used frequently by DevOps experts, but are constantly rated as valuable by the organization. Overrated, metrics that are frequently used by DevOps experts but are not rated as valuable by the organization. And then distraction, metrics that are frequently used by not frequently used by DevOps experts and are not valued as much as within the organizations that use them. So let's look at the build sequence here, okay? And by the way, the little icon that you see after the ranking heat map is basically an icon showing that it's recommended in our DevOps maturity model. Meaning that if you look at the Tricentis DevOps maturity model, you will see that these metrics are highly valued within context of our our continuous testing maturity model. And the way we looked at this thing is the following. We took the metrics that were more frequently highlighted by both laggards and leaders. We forced ranked the usage rank and then forced ranked a value rank, okay? Meaning that the usage rank was how often they were declared used, and the value rank was, what was the incremental differences associated with the organizations that ranked them as valuable. We offered a force ranking with individuals, and they had to force rank how these things were valued, and this is what actually precipitated the value ranking. So when we look at the build scenario, what you'll find in the value added areas is that we have successful code builds as one of the most significant ratings, and I don't think you can really argue with that, as that is probably your entry card into the build arena, right? That the build actually was successful. But what you'll also see here in the hidden gems, and this is where in the green you'll find that the DevOps leaders really were using these things, which is the automated test prioritized by risk. And you see this concept of risk coming up, as well as test case coverage coming up in the value added segment. One oddity that happened here within the research that we did was a test hygiene. Test hygiene turned out to be a metric that was highly valued by DevOps leaders, but also valued lowly and measured infrequently. But when you correlated the results between DevOps leaders versus DevOps laggards, what you found were leaders were more likely to look at the process in which test hygiene was a part of versus a organization who were considered laggards who probably weren't looking at test hygiene at all. So the metrics that were in this particular ranking heat map, you can see are more highly correlated to metrics that you might consider as part of the build. Okay. So let's move on to functional validation. Now, when you look at functional validation, you'll see that the ranking heat map shows some pretty interesting findings here. So first of all, it's all over the map compared to, let me just go back to the build, where on the value rank, it seems extraordinarily consistent, and the usage rank seems, not as random. Here you have some really tight metrics that come in through number 1 through, let's just say 8 here, where the value ranking and the usage ranking are somewhat correlated. Very interesting findings. We find a lot of kind of correlations almost on this sloped axis right up through a distraction versus value added. And the interesting thing here to look at is requirements covered by tests. So requirements coverage in terms of functional validation is by far the most value added metric. And then you see this idea of risk and code coverage coming as a tie right below it. And this is actually an interesting finding. Not only is it a CTMM, a continuous testing maturity model favorite in terms of understanding the maturity of process, it also has come in very highly value added. The hidden gem here, which I still don't have enough data to explain, was new defects, but it's right on that barrier to say that it could be considered value added. The other two things that I want to point out in this particular functional validation area is the concept of test effectiveness and release readiness, which are in the distraction buckets. So comparatively, to the build phase, there was a lot more metrics that landed in the distraction phase for functional validation. And I gotta admit here, I think what this is exposing is a maturity gap. As we look to more automated processes to assist us in release decisions, release readiness is going to have to mature significantly towards a more value-added component or a value-added metric, as well as test effectiveness. So with that perspective, what we're finding here is that I think we've actually hit a gap from a functional validation perspective. And I think I have an explanation for it, but this is, again, another hypothesis that I'm probably going to have to test. So from a functional validation perspective, what I believe has happened is that we've seen with shift left is potentially a bit of an over-rotation towards unit testing. And when you over-rotate your functional validation towards unit testing, your concept of release readiness is somewhat distracted from a more holistic picture of the application quality to the code or the value or readiness of the actual requirement itself. Meaning this is actually testing the requirement versus testing the release readiness of the application state itself. So when you look at this concept of shift left, on the left side of the equation, your testing effort tends to be much more myopic. And with that, the idea of release readiness seems to get scoped out of the overall measurement. Yet, as we move forward and mature even more from a speed and effectiveness perspective, release readiness is going to be a component or a distinct level of a detail that I believe we're going to need to have confidence in to move forward faster. So this was the functional validation finding. So let's move on to integration testing. And as I mentioned before, excuse me, this does not only include API testing, but also some organizations answered this in the more traditional case of component integration testing within the application itself. But with this, we see almost the same distinct pattern as what we saw with functional validation. We see the same clustering of value, meaning a high correlation between the value rank and the usage rank. So we see a nice tight correlation, especially on number 1 through 8. You started to see it actually correlate kind of nicely on the bottom half as well. But nonetheless, what you will find here is that the integration pattern is primarily almost the same as the functional validation pattern. But a couple things to note here is open defects and as well as defect density here. In the case of integration testing, especially when organizations were looking at exercising APIs in this level, the idea of open defects and the idea of defect density compared to the integration dependency turned out to be quite high. So as organizations start to test or integration test, and there are dependencies that are out of their control, the idea of these metrics being more valuable because those assets were out of their control seemed to be more highly rated over time. Again, you see a pretty distinct slope in integration testing here, from distraction through value added. And again, you see release readiness, much lower in the quadrant here as identified as a distraction. And I do believe that the same logic applies here, that ideas around release readiness are going to have to be more prominent as we begin to mature, or you move into more distributed architectures like a microservice architecture, right? In that case, all those dependencies that are presented from an API perspective are going to have to play within a release readiness context. And those elements are going to have to present themselves as a more complete picture of release readiness. Unfortunately, and I forgot to mention this in the other segment though, is when you get into the concept of release readiness, you also start to hit a very ugly word in testing, and development, which is governance. And unfortunately, release readiness as a metric, I believe, is going to require much, much more governance surrounding our process. And of course, it's a give and take. So let's move on to end-to-end regression testing. And in end-to-end regression testing, we see, again, with usage rank and value rank, some nice tight correlation. Yet we see some things start to pop up here. Percent of automated test cases become more value added. Idea of requirements covered by tests, again, in the value added area. With the other thing that was kind of interesting here is risk coverage, which you would expect, begins to have more independence as a value added metric, and it's not necessarily tied to coverage anymore in the end-to-end regression test. Because the end-to-end regression test starts to divorce the analysis from the actual application itself and starts to add in the concept of the user journey. So I think we see a lot of logical steps starting to happen here. The idea of end-to-end risk that is defined by business risk starts to prevail, and more of your counting metrics or process metrics associated with the actual testing process start to become more and more of a distraction. So I would say from an end-to-end regression testing, this performed as we somewhat expected. And I wanted to point out the movement of another metric here. Look at release readiness. At this point in time, as you started to hone in on the user journey, release readiness became more of a hidden gem. And that was actually a nice thing to see, because we would hope as we move farther up or more towards the release event in this time horizon, that the release readiness concept would start to come more into focus. The other thing I wanted to mention here is variance from baselines of percent of test cases passed. So very interesting. This metric came in as a early write-in from the early part of our process, and then we worked it into our overarching survey. And what this meant was that we were actually able to ask the question on whether the percentage or variance of the percentage of test cases that were actually passing was a valuable metric in terms of observing the overarching risk associated with the release. And it turns out to be that it actually did have much, much more value. It came in at number 9 in terms of the usage ranking, and came in at also number 9 in terms of the value ranking. But using this incremental approach to what was run or not run seems to have value in the long term when you're looking at the end-to-end regression testing. So that goes through the major time horizons. And what I would recommend in terms of using those quadrants is, if you're really looking at redoing some metrics or adding metrics, use these as guideposts. I can't tell you that when you pull together all 603 responses that we somewhat homogenize the responses. So it means that we kind of dilute the idea of specificity for an individual organization or account, right? So your process, your app, your user persona that you're protecting will ultimately change. So you need to add your own flavor to how you're interpreting these metrics. Yet, as a baseline approach to how I would actually build out my metrics, I think it's extraordinarily valuable to use these quadrants that we presented in the previous slide. So let me move on to really some of the categorized ideas and really highlight some other metrics. So essentially, for the metrics that were essentially noted as overrated, that were commonly used but rarely ranked as high value, the number of automated tests from the build category, the defect status by priority in the end-to-end testing, and the requirements covered by test in the build. These all seem to be the ones that are commonly used but rarely ranked in high value. The interesting thing here is requirements covered by tests. especially within the build phase. This was a little bit of a shock to me in terms of would I like requirements coverage, in the early part of the build. I think I would. So we're going to have to figure out, as I mentioned before, in some of these metrics, why, and take the next deeper dive. But in terms of this was a bit of a shock to see requirements covered by tests in the build phase to be considered overrated. Hidden gems. So the following metrics are the ones that are not commonly used, even among DevOps experts, but are ranked extremely valuable by those who measure them. So new defects, critical defects, automated tests prioritized by risk. I think that's significant. Coverage, code coverage, test case executed, static analysis. A lot of build dominance here. Variance from baseline of the test cases passed. I mentioned that previously, that this seemed to have some significant movement, and not only in terms of popularity, but also of importance. And of course, release readiness seems to be one of the hidden gems as we move into more and more automation. DevOps differentiators. So when we really look across the board on the DevOps differentiators, the ones that are also represented in our continuous testing maturity model, this is where the DevOps leaders, laggards measure the following metrics significantly more than the DevOps laggards, right? So when you saw that little category, not only was it noted in our CTMM, but you'll also see that these are the top DevOps differentiators. So these are the metrics that the leaders are more or less following more categorically, which include automated tests prioritized by risk, percentage of automated end-to-end tests. This is actually the percentage of automated end-to-end tests versus your total test suite. Risk coverage, release readiness again, test efficiency, requirements covered by test, test case coverage, static analysis results, variance from baselines, right, and test effectiveness. So the interesting thing here is this list of metrics also correlates quite well to the concept of having more context around what you're also measuring. So obviously, risk coverage, release readiness, which has to have a context behind it, test efficiency, which has to have a definition behind it, obviously, static analysis results, which actually has some extraordinary depth behind it, meaning if a static analysis result fires, it also means that there is a definition or pattern below it. So there's some extreme context around the static analysis finding itself. Variance from baseline also means that not only are we calculating a diff, so it has context in what it is measuring, it's also measuring the degree away from that baseline. And then test effectiveness, which also has a more of a governance baseline to it as well. So in summary, when I look at the DevOps differentiators, not only do they have more context to it, but they also have a lot more depth in terms of what they're measuring. And that context is also wrapped in, dare I say that bad word, governance, okay? So the top DevOps differentiators are really a significant finding here. Now, how to use this as you go off and relook at metrics for your next phase of your DevOps initiative, I would really look at these first. I would say that these are the ones that you could pinpoint as having significant value. Most used by DevOps experts. I would say that these are the most overall, most frequently used. And here we see test case coverage again. A lot of pass fails come in here. API bug density. This is kind of interesting. Let me spend a little bit of time on this. But I think when I look at this and I see the shift to much more distributed architectures, looking at the API as a dependency that could be in or outside of our control, and the density of bugs that are being introduced by these APIs is a considerable factor in terms of the effectiveness of your process. So I think it's extraordinarily interesting how the API bug density has risen to a really interesting metric in the purview of DevOps experts. Again, we see here that requirements covered by tests also is popular in the functional validation and the end-to-end. Most valued by DevOps experts. This is the most highly valued overall. Again, requirements covered by API tests. This actually has an interesting talk track behind it because the requirements covered by API tests is you would think is a coverage metric. It's also a speed metric, meaning that this is where organizations have shifted to API tests as the primary method of actually looking at the requirement itself. Testing the API where you might not have as frequent of changes as the UI gives you a little bit more automation freedom, number one. And number two, a little bit more consistency in terms of the test execution itself. So looking at the API test coverage kind of shows that you're actually shifting to much more of an automation purview, which is, I think, very critical. Requirements covered by tests is not a surprise to us at this point. We can see that if they're most valued by DevOps experts here, that the requirements coverage upon the event horizon of a release is critical here in order to make decisions. And then the other thing here that I wanted to note here is that the new API defects found, again, pretty critical as we see the shift in architectures and how the pertinence of APIs are going to matter in the overall basically end-to-end experience of our users. So basically, let me leave it there. We've gone for roughly what I expected, a little bit over 40 minutes. And again, let me offer you the full report. If you would like to use this report, I think it's extraordinarily valuable. Number one, it goes into a lot of detail associated with all the metrics we just covered, plus a lot more. So roughly in this report, we probably covered only 50% of the metrics that were actually assessed in the research report that Tricentis did with Forrester. Again, the caveat I would add while using this information is that it basically needs to apply to your organization and your application, as well as the unique risk profile that comes along with your organization or the application that's under test. So, take everything with a grain of salt. Yet, some of those lists that you saw at the back end, I think are just as highly valuable as the ones you saw in the 2x2 matrix, meaning that take it from the experts. These are the ones that had made the shift. And within the shift, they also had to actually make a commitment to measuring what's important. So fundamentally, as they shift their process, the metrics shifted as well. Okay, thank you for allowing me to do a sprint there in terms of metrics. It seemed like a long chat, but there are some questions that have come in, and if you don't mind, let me just read a couple here while we have like 5-6 minutes left in this broadcast. So the first question here is one that I always get, and I selected it as, where do I start? And I think, where do I start? By the way, I summarized the question here, and it actually came in as a question in a number of different forms, like how to start, where to start. I have a mobile application, where should I start? And I think it all starts in the same spot. It starts by assessing the relative risk of your application under test, the user journey, and the importance to the business itself. In this case, what you're going to do is triangulate around the concept of business risk. And once it's documented, it's going to give you a better idea of a baseline that you're going to set in order to derive the rest of your metrics. I'd also say that if you look at the various time horizons associated with the metrics that we presented, so for example, build, functional validation, integration, and end-to-end testing, you're going to have to make separate decisions across each one of those time horizons, depending on where you are. So the last note about where to start, I would say no matter what, you start with risk and business risk and the definition of what that is. The second thing, though, is you got to understand where you are. So just going from pure counting metrics that have no context into basic contextual metrics is going to require a lot of self-investment, as well as a lot of governance, meaning that you're going to have to the actual details associated with the definitions themselves. So this is going to require a team approach, and that team approach is going to have to come up with standard definitions. So the journey starts with the definition of risk and then proceeds along the idea of how governance is going to take over the process itself. Okay, let me look for another question here. Okay, this one was highlighted. Okay, so this one has to do more about architecture. This organization tends to have more legacy. If I read the question or summarize it, they have more legacy-based applications, and they are moving towards more of an agile DevOps approach. What would you recommend? Okay, this is interesting. The other correlation that I think becomes obvious as you go through this report is organizations with a deeper legacy application set also tend to have higher business risk. And why? Well, these are usually older, more transactional, rich organizations that have a significant level of business risk behind the application set itself. So with this, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record. I would actually start with the definition of business risk. And then at this point, what I would do, especially if you're looking at the end-to-end perspective, is I would look at the application dependencies that have to do with the user journey and prioritize those dependencies immediately. And then within those application sets, understand from your perspective what access you do have and how you would like to measure risk versus what you have access to. So let me explain what I mean by that. So if your access point is an API in which you are a consumer, you really start to need to actually define the risk associated with that dependency, and as early in the process as possible, understand if you have any changes or dependency risks associated with that API. So I would highlight that significantly. The second thing I would do at this point in time is understand all the other application dependencies and see what metrics you can get from those teams themselves. At this point, your idea of actually creating a more converged dashboard associated with the metrics or upon build, I would say, on what metrics you can collect is going to make a distinct difference on how you approach the project itself. Obviously, the idea of metrics is pretty sensitive. It's going to take a lot of collaboration to come to your defined set. But needless to say, once you get down to it, I believe this report is going to help guide you with some really fantastic ideas associated with your metrics-based project. So I think my time is up. I would really like to thank you guys for sticking in there with me. I know it seems like I've just been dumping information at a rapid rate, which is, I think, what a webinar is all about. But thank you very much for joining me. And again, if you'd like to get the depth of this report, please hit this URL and you can get the details associated with the metrics themselves. And again, the report actually surveys something, I think it's 70 or 80 different types of metrics. Okay, with that, let me thank you for joining and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.